All right, I see it is just about 1 o'clock our time here locally. I believe that would make it about 11 where you are, Yvette. Is that correct?
That's correct.
All right, fantastic. We're going to get started here in just a moment. As our participants are getting logged in, I'd like to take a moment to welcome you all. My name is Steve Keller. I am the curriculum developer of online platforms and programs for the YMCA's Youth Cannabis Awareness Program. As you can see in the chat, my pronouns are he, him, and his. I am presenting from sunny, beautiful, sweltering hot Peterborough, Ontario. And joining me as well, we have Yvette Clark. Would you like to take a moment to introduce yourself while we get started here, Yvette?
Hi, yes, I'm Yvette Clark. I'm the Education and Awareness Coordinator for the YCAP Youth Cannabis Awareness Program, and I'm based in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. Also quite sunny today.
Is it still hot? Still hot out west?
Not as hot. We've cooled down a little the last few days. A hot weekend coming up, but definitely not as hot as a week or so ago.
That's good to hear. Good to hear. We finally got some heat back in southern Ontario. The humidex has been around 40 for the last 4 or 5 days.
Wow.
A little toasty, but it's supposed to cool down tomorrow. So,
yeah.
All right. Now, as again, I see it is the top of the hour, local time. So before we get into the notion of the presentation today, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that, again, I am presenting from Peterborough, Ontario, which is on lands of the Williams Treaty of the Mississauga Anishinaabe, adjacent to the Haudenosaunee territory. As a settler here in Canada, I would like to acknowledge and welcome those from the Indigenous communities, those that I've been very fortunate to work with over the last number of years locally, whether that is Alderville, Curve Lake, Hiawatha, or in the Mohawk community of Tyendinaga. As we are all treaty people, I think it's very important to begin a presentation by acknowledging and encouraging our communities to be able to continue working together and learning from one another. Yvette?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would like to acknowledge that I am presenting from Saskatoon, which is on Treaty 6 territory. It's the ancestral and traditional territory of the Cree, Dene, Blackfoot, Saulteaux, Lakota Sioux, as well as the land of the Métis. I acknowledge the many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit ancestors of these lands and reaffirm our relationship with one another. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Now, we are going to get into the notion of what it is we're here to talk about today. As you can see on the title slide, we are going to be talking about cannabis. There is a lot to be covered over the next 60 minutes. Now, despite the amount and depth of the content that we have, we do encourage these presentations to be as engaging as possible. Therefore, during the presentation, you will see various polling opportunities for you to be able to answer poll questions that come up, as well as some open-ended questions that we certainly encourage you to participate in with the questions and answer or the chat panel during the presentation. Or if you simply just have any questions or comments you'd like us to address during the discussion, feel free to put them in and we'll see what we can do, either in text or discussing them aloud. All right. So we're going to talk about cannabis. So what is it that we have to talk about? Well, we need an operational definition. So we are going to spend a little bit of time talking about what is cannabis. We're going to be talking about the various forms, the prevalence of use, the popular methods of cannabis use, particularly amongst youth, as we are youth cannabis awareness. We also are going to be looking at some of the specific and unique risks of various methods of cannabis consumption, because we know that cannabis itself does carry certain potentials for risk or potential harm. But there are sort of specific risks that are unique to each method of consumption that we're going to get into today. We are also going to speak about harm reduction and healthy living strategies for individuals that may know someone or may themselves be considering using cannabis. And finally, where it is that individuals can learn more or find support adjacent or supportive to what you will be learning today. So perhaps some of you saw us do a presentation in the winter whereby we did a data mine sort of harvest of the landscape of youth cannabis use here in Canada. And at the start of that presentation, just like the start of every presentation, we always take a moment to talk about who we are here in YCAP. Now, the first thing about our program is that we are neutral on the topic of cannabis. In fact, when we talk about being neutral, what are we getting at here?
So when we talk about being neutral, we definitely don't pass judgment. We accept that there are people that use cannabis and we pass no judgment on those users, but we do approach from a harm reduction perspective, especially aimed at youth. So looking at both the risks and the benefits of cannabis.
Absolutely. And from there, we do discuss the balanced perspective. You made the excellent point that we do acknowledge that people use cannabis. You've also made an excellent one over the last couple of days that we should acknowledge that some people don't use cannabis, and those decisions are theirs to make. We try to make sure that we promote the uses as well as the risks, not sort of promote the uses, sorry, explain the uses as well as the risks, while providing unbiased information based on research that we've seen from various empirical sources. And the final thing that we talk about is harm reduction. Yvette, what are we getting at when we talk about harm reduction?
So with harm reduction, we're definitely looking at trying to minimize the risks associated with cannabis. And we do this by providing evidence-based information so that people can make informed decisions. The same way as when you're going to cross a road, you look left and right before you cross. Same thing with cannabis. We try and look at ways of trying to reduce the risk associated with any use that people may take part in.
Absolutely. I couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah, so moving on, throughout our presentation, we do have a series of poll questions which we present to you. And so I'm going to launch the first one now. It's a very basic one just to get you in the habit of answering the polls. And if you wouldn't mind providing your answers. So what is cannabis? Is it a plant whose leaves and flowers can be used for medicinal purposes? A plant whose stem can be used to make various materials? A plant whose regular use can develop a harming brain, or all of the above? And I see that we have good participation here, Steve. Just waiting a few more minutes to let everyone have a chance to vote. We are almost there. And I'll be closing the vote off in 3, 2, 1. Thank you to everyone who did vote. So Steve, I see that our audience has said mostly D, all of the above. Would you like to share the answer with us?
Absolutely. There's not really a wrong answer here. All of these really explain something about cannabis to varying extents. Now, we know that cannabis is sort of the scientific name for the hemp plant. We've seen it take on many different names over the years, such as weed, pot, dope, hash, marijuana, different ones carrying sort of different levels of formality, conversationalism, some even carrying a little bit of stigma, which we'll talk about in the future workshops on stigma and mental health. We do also know that cannabis has an extensive history of use and recognizability around the world. We've seen earliest studies showing the existence of cannabis plants as far as 38 million years ago, and earliest uses of time being around 5000 BC. We've seen the fibers, oils, seeds, and proteins used for building materials, ropes, textiles, clothing. But really the focus of what most of us look at, and our program as well, is the chemicals in the leaves and the flowers that are used for both medical treatment and recreation. Now, we will speak somewhat to the medical side of cannabis use, but really the primary goal or focus of our program is to look at recreational cannabis use. So if you do have additional questions surrounding the medicinal uses or medical purposes of cannabis, we certainly encourage you to connect with your with local healthcare providers or certain other resources that we will get into as we go along today. Yvette?
Yeah, absolutely. So that brings us to our next question, our next poll question, and that is the chemical in cannabis known for changing the way we think, act, and feel. Is it A, tetrahydrocannabinol or THC, or B, cannabidiol, CBD? And again, I'll give you a few seconds just to get your answers in.
Polls are very quick today.
They are. Everyone is participating really well, so thank you for that. We have about 85% who have participated, and I'm going to close the poll in 3, 2, 1. Ending the poll there. So Steve, our audience says THC. Is this the correct answer?
Appears to be. Do you want to elaborate a little further?
Definitely. So yes, in terms of chemicals in cannabis, there are actually many chemicals in cannabis, but we do focus on the two main ones, which is the tetrahydrocannabinol or THC. This is the psychoactive component of cannabis. It's the component that changes the way that we think, feel, and act, and it's the component that gives us that high feeling. Cannabidiol or CBD is the more therapeutic component in cannabis. It doesn't produce that psychoactive result or that high feeling. And it's the one that is used more for medicinal purposes. Thanks, Steve.
Anytime.
Yeah, so that takes me to our next poll question. I am going to be running all the polls today, so you'll be hearing my voice with all of those. And we're launching the next one. So in terms of cannabis use in Canada, which age group do you think has the highest percent of cannabis users in Canada? 15 to 24, 25 to 44, 45 to 64, or 65 and above? And again, getting some great participation. Thank you very much. And give a couple more seconds, closing in 3, 2, 1. So, Steve, our audience says the age 25 to 44. What is a great answer?
Now, based on research that we've seen across multiple surveys, sometimes the data conflicts slightly, but the majority of research that we've seen overall is the largest percentage of cannabis users in Canada is represented in ages 15 to 24. Now, this is according to looking at the CTADS, which is the Canadian Tobacco, Alcohol and Drug Survey, as well as the Canadian Cannabis Survey and the Canadian Student Tobacco, Alcohol and Drug Survey. Even the National Cannabis Survey has these two numbers very, very close to each other, and different reporting periods have actually shown sometimes one passes the other. This is fairly consistent with many other countries, particularly in Europe, whereby I believe in 2015 or 14, it was estimated that every country in Europe except for Belgium, the highest rate was amongst 15 to 24, followed by 25 to 34. Now, if we were to look more particularly at youth, sort of that younger demographic, if we were looking at rate of use by percentage by grade between 7 and 12, we do see that the rate does increase with age. It starts quite low, about 1 in 40 or 2.4%, climbing to about 5.8 in grade 8, about 1 in 8 by grade 9, a little over a quarter by grade 11, before finally increasing all the way to about 37.7% of grade 12s. Now, we do have a poll for this, this sort of statistical data as well. Is that correct, Yvette?
Yes, we do. So I'm going to launch that poll right now. Are these the numbers that you would expect to see for these grades? Do you think it's what you would see, or do you think it's maybe less, or do you think these are exactly what you would expect?
Mm-hmm.
And again, some great participation. Just giving everyone a few minutes to get those clicks in.
Mm-hmm. Got about 3/4 of the vote already. Like a quick responding audience, keeps things moving.
Yeah, so I'm going to be ending the poll there and sharing the results with you. So Steve, most of the people agree and would have guessed that this was correct.
Absolutely. Now, I see around 1 in 5 would say that they thought more youth might have said they use cannabis. And the reason that we like to bring this up, you may have heard us say this in another workshop as well, is there's a bit of an overestimation of how many youth do use cannabis, but particularly from youth themselves. There's this sort of a misconception or a myth shared amongst youth that like everyone's doing it or everyone has tried it. But as we see, even at the highest apex of use by grade 12 in high school, the number still isn't over 50%. It's not even over 40%. So even though this number does increase with age, the majority of youth do not actually report using cannabis in the past 12 months. But we do see an increase. And this kind of leads us to that question of why does that happen? Or more generally, why might youth choose to use cannabis? And you can enter this into the question and answer your panel. You can enter this into the chat panel. What might be some reasons that you believe that youth may choose to use cannabis? We'll give you a few moments to type in your responses, whatever you think. And there's really no wrong answers.
Absolutely. I see curiosities come up there, Steve.
Okay.
Peer pressure, a couple of those, coping with stress, sleep and stress reduction, fun, anxiety, mental health. A couple of really good answers, Steve. Would you like to discuss those a bit further?
Absolutely. So based on research that we've seen from the Canadian Students for Sensible Drug Policy, or the CSSDP, both in their 2018 Cannabis Talk Toolkit, as well as this year's sort of iteration of the Cannabis Talk Toolkit, there really is kind of a collection of about 5 reasons you can sort of collect a majority of these answers into. The first one is the idea of enjoyment, right? Youth hear cannabis is fun, they want to give it a try. There's that idea of experimenting. Again, they haven't done it before, they've heard someone else talk about it, maybe they've seen someone else that they know try it, so they experiment. There's this idea of socializing, which kind of carries 2 aspects. First is the notion of peer pressure that we hear that, you know, they may believe if others are doing it, they should try it. Or if they go to a party, someone offers it, someone says, oh, well, you know, everybody else is doing it. But there is another aspect of socialization in that some people, if they're using a substance or committing to a behavior, if that behavior is shared with people that they know, this may be something that they bond over and simply socialize over. That idea of socializing isn't always a connotation of peer pressure, but peer pressure is an aspect of it, shall we say. There's the ideas of self-medication and dealing with stress, and we like to kind of combine these 2 together and make sure that we inform our audience that they understand that if you or someone you know is considering using cannabis as a medicinal herb or as a medicinal purpose, especially when it comes to dealing with physical or mental health issues or distress in your life, it is a good idea to speak to a medical professional or practitioner before doing so, just to make sure that you're aware of sort of which products may be right for you, which may not be right for you, and where it might be a good idea to get when we're looking at safer products and safer consumption. Yvette?
Yeah, absolutely. So this brings us to our next poll question. Moving into the legal side of cannabis, what is the average legal age to buy, consume, or possess cannabis in Canada? Is it 16? Is it 18, 19, or 21? And again, there may actually be more than one correct answer here. So there's a little bit of a twist to this one. Okay, and I see we're at a very good percentage of votage again. I'm going to close the poll in 3, 2, and 1. Ending poll there. So the majority of our audience are saying 19 years old. Steve, would you like to reveal that answer for us? Yeah, absolutely. So in most of the provinces in Canada, the legal age is in fact 19 years old, but there's a couple of exceptions. It's 18 in Alberta, and in Quebec, it's actually 21 years old. So why is this important? First of all, when cannabis was legalized, the Cannabis Act really was launched, and it was aimed at trying to take cannabis out of the hands of youth, take it out of the hand of the illegal market, and definitely try and reduce the consequences of cannabis and its effects on youth in particular. So if we look at the Cannabis Act, we're comparing people who are under the legal age and then those who are of age. And let's look at some of the criteria. So first of all, for a youth, if they are caught possessing 5 grams of illicit cannabis or something equivalent, they're in trouble. This is not allowed, and they could get fined. They could get repercussions for that. For adults who are of legal age, they are allowed to possess 30 grams of cannabis, but not more, and definitely, again, not the illicit cannabis products. In terms of cannabis growing of plants, youth are not allowed to grow cannabis plants, but adults who are of legal age are allowed to grow 4 plants per household. And that's not per person per household, but per household in general.
Now, there are 3 provinces whereby you cannot actually grow cannabis at all, and those would be Manitoba, Quebec, and Nunavut. So that's why we have that little asterisk next to it.
Absolutely. Thanks, Steve. Furthermore, youth are not allowed to attempt or to buy or sell cannabis. And on the other side of that, adults may not buy, sell, or give cannabis to a minor. And there are very serious consequences for this. Apart from fines, there could also be a 14-year jail sentence if an adult is found involving youth in that distribution or even holding cannabis for them. So that brings us to that next point. Youth may not exchange or give it to other minors. And also, as an adult, you may not involve a youth in a cannabis-related offense. An example of that would be if you were taking cannabis over the border and you put it in a youth's backpack to carry for you in case, in fear of getting caught. This would be a very serious crime, as I discussed earlier. And then obviously driving while impaired. It is not really acceptable for youth or adults to be driving under the use of cannabis or under the influence of cannabis. Even if you are supervising a learner driver in some provinces, this would be considered extremely unforgiving and not acceptable. So we looked at some of the reasons why youth would choose to use cannabis, and I would ask you to please type into the question or the comment section, what are some of the reasons why youth choose to avoid using cannabis, either side of the scale? And we'll give you a few minutes to type in your comments. Fear of repercussions from parents. Great answer. Education on the adverse effect, well educated. Parents' anxiety, focus on education. Absolutely, these are fantastic answers. Thank you, everybody. Afraid, unsure of the impacts. Absolutely, great answers, and I think you have really covered a lot of what we're going to reveal to you now. So going through some of these reasons why youth might choose to avoid using cannabis. First one, obviously the concerns about the legal consequences, for example, or the fear and associated with using cannabis. Secondly, perhaps they have tried it in the past and they've had a negative experience, and so in the future they stay away from cannabis use. The health risks, maybe they definitely understand some of the health risks and they therefore want to avoid use of cannabis. Opinions about substance use. Maybe they have set views on the fact that they don't want to be using it, or just views on using substances in general and would prefer to stay away from them. Lack of interest. Some youth just have no interest in using cannabis and they really don't want to even experiment or try it out. And lastly, the idea of stigma. And this is really a big one. You know, the idea that there's a stigma associated with using drugs and in particular cannabis. That is the kind of the perception that if one is using cannabis, you fall into a certain category or you have a certain personality or certain traits associated with that use. We in the YCAP are definitely developing a lot of material around this topic of stigma because it is a very important one, and it's definitely part of our aim to try and reduce some of the misconceptions that are associated with cannabis use around this topic. Thanks, Steve.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. That was excellent, by the way. So we've looked at reasons why youth may use, reasons why youth may not use, some of the legal ramifications. Let's take a look at the plant itself. How is the plant actually consumed? And there are various different methods of this. These can be things like vaping, you know, taking either a juice cartridge, an e-cigarette cartridge, or sort of an ETHC cartridge, or even dried leaf cannabis and heating it electronically to a lower temperature to heat. Dabbing, this is sort of extracting the product itself, the cannabinoid you're after, usually THC, getting it out of the leaf itself, sort of crystallizing that into a product, and then heating that to a very hot temperature and then inhaling the fumes. Smoking dried leaf product, this is the one that most people are familiar with. This is the idea of smoking joints, pipes, bongs. We have drinking cannabis-infused beverages. These could be sparkling sodas. These could be teas. We see edibles. These could be gummies, cookies, brownies, cakes. And finally, we see topicals. So the idea of applying these directly to the skin. There are also sprays, tinctures, and sort of those sublingual drops that could be applied underneath the tongue. However, we know the prevalence of use with those is substantially lower than the rest of the products that we have listed here. So we thought we'd mention it, but it's not quite on the list here at the moment.
Yeah, so having had that brief overview of the different methods, which one do you think is the most popular amongst youth in Canada? And again, we've launched a poll there for your participation.
Mm-hmm.
Smoking and vaping coming up as strong contenders.
Mm-hmm. The numbers are actually a little surprising. The more I kind of think about this, now that I've seen it several times, the numbers are a little surprising.
Absolutely.
So.
Okay, and I'm going to end the poll in 3, 2, 1 and share the results. Steve, our audience is leaning towards smoking. All right.
I do see that there is that idea of vaping being the second highest. We do see smoking is currently the most popular, according to just about every survey model that we've looked at. When we looked at the 2018-2019 reported methods of consumption, we saw smoking was first. It actually had a slight decrease from about 84% of youth reporting, of cannabis users reporting they do it through smoking, down to about 76. Eating, vaporizing, and dabbing all saw increases. Vaporizing saw the largest amount of an increase when it came to percentage of cannabis users. However, edibles do remain the second most prevalent, and we even saw this with last year's Canadian cannabis survey. And the dried leaf cannabis and pre-rolled market still does dominate a lot of the economy. I did see the economic report, I believe it was for the province of Ontario, that stated last year about 70% of all sales were still on dried leaf and pre-rolls. So we see smoking still does control the market overall, although the others are seeing an increase in prevalence. Is that?
Yeah, so obviously each of those different methods has different risks associated with it, which we're going to go into. But when we think about THC, we know that it affects different people differently. Would you mind commenting on why you think that would be, or how is it that THC affects everyone differently? And any suggestions that you may have, just pop them into the chat section and then we all have a discussion.
Yeah. Why is it that if two people could smoke the same product, that they may have completely different effects? Mm-hmm. As one example, there are other examples we could talk about here.
Give you a few minutes to think on that one.
Mm-hmm.
Different brain vulnerabilities, different expectations, body chemistry, emotional state. Some really good answers.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you to everyone who's putting some answers in for us.
Yeah. Do you want to show a few and just allow people to put them in?
Yeah. I think, that definitely some of those are covered, but let's have a look at some of them as we go through here.
All right.
Yeah, so age, definitely your age, your size, your height and weight. We know that cannabis is absorbed into the fat cells of people, so definitely differences in body size and composition. Previous experience with cannabis, if you're using it for the first time or you have used it a couple of times, for example, you may get a different effect. The amount and the method of cannabis consumed, very big criteria here, and we will go into this in a lot more detail. Medical history, if you have used cannabis in conjunction with other substances, for example, alcohol and nicotine, and again, we will discuss these in more detail. Some other examples might include, I'm just waiting for Steve, how much THC or CBD is in the product. Definitely a huge contributing factor. Like we said, THC being that psychoactive component and CBD the non-psychoactive component. And then your current mood and state of mind, and someone did mention that. And then also how often they use cannabis. If they're using it very frequently, that idea of their tolerance being experienced. Okay, so moving on to some more information on potency, Steve.
Absolutely. Now, it is really important to understand that different cannabis products can have differing levels of both THC and CBD. So when we look at dried flower and leaf cannabis, we see that the potency is usually an average of 15%, but we have seen dried leaf products as high as 30% potency when it comes to THC, meaning that for each gram of total cannabis, 30% of that would be the THC cannabinoid. Physical extracts such as your hashes and your keefs can actually be as high as 80%. We've seen even resources over the last few years that had them around 60%, but we have seen products for sale in a few of the provincial retailers that have some bubble hashes, for example, that are up around 71 to 81%. So we know the number is increasing as producers kind of continue to develop stronger products over time. Chemical extracts, your shatter, your butter, your wax can be up to or over even 90%, as well as sort of your juices, your e-juices and your vape juices. These are very sort of specialized and purified products that are really looking to get a specific product from the cannabis plant altogether. So these are where you'll see some that may be engineered into the mid to high 90s. And we know that the strength can really be correlated to the more potent level of the product, as well as sort of the potential for greater risks to health, particularly mental health, which we will get into throughout the presentation. Now, some methods, and sometimes people would ask, if we know that these percentages work out like this, is there a way we could actually allocate how much is low strength, high strength, medium strength? Or is there a way we could set up what one dose or one serving would be? Now, Canada's National Institute for Cannabis Health and Education, or NICE, proposed, I think it was 2018, that one dose or serving of edible cannabis should be about 2.5% for edibles. This is not for inhaled, and we'll talk about why in a bit. It can be very hard to find an accurate dose in cannabis due to the differences in the THC level in products, how it can be absorbed, as we talked about earlier, and the person using cannabis themselves. So this dose really has been proposed, but again, it's not an exact science. And having an idea of it, though, is still important. And the reason why it's still important is if you know that one dose of edible is 2.5 milligrams, an individual taking edible cannabis can see how much that one dose will make them feel, or that one serving will make them feel. And setting it at a lower level allows them to be more mindful of their own limits and their own capabilities when it comes to consuming products. Now, legal market cannabis edibles can have up to 10 milligrams per package total, or 4 servings of 2.5 milligrams. Now, illicit and homemade products, this is often a way to tell if a product is legal or not, if it reads as having more than 10 milligrams in a total edible package. We've seen products as high as 250 milligrams, 300 milligrams, 50 milligrams, 100 milligrams. Now, these products may also have different levels of THC within each piece of the package. So if you were to buy 2 cookies from the legal market, typically and ideally, they will have about 5 milligrams of THC in each. And they can only be off by a very small amount. So they are going to be mostly the same amount. But an illicit market product may not follow these same numbers. It could be due to incorrect math. It could be due to the product not being mixed quite as well, that you may have, say, 75% of the THC in one serving and only 25% in the other. And if you don't know this, what can you do? If you don't know how much THC is in the product you're using, or if you don't even know how it's going to affect you, what is it you do? Well, there's a mantra or an idea that we often hear from people where they talk about starting low and going slow. We really want to know what that means, right? So starting low is, if you don't know how much THC is in a product, start with a small amount. If you're smoking, if you're vaping, start with 1 puff, start with 1 smaller pull, and wait and see how you feel. If you're using an edible, start with a small piece of that edible. And again, wait to see how it's going to make you feel before deciding if you want to have more. Smoking and vaping cannabis, we know that the effects can be felt within seconds to minutes and generally kind of hit sort of a climactic point around 30 minutes. So try to wait about 10 to 20 and see how you feel. Ingested cannabis can take substantially longer. The effects of ingested products can take up to 4 hours. So with that in mind, if you take a bite and you don't feel anything after a half an hour, you may not feel anything for another couple of hours. And this can be particularly risky for youth, and we'll talk about why that is here in a bit. But it is important to really wait and see how it is that you feel before choosing if you want to have more.
And Steve, before we move on, I see that there's a question from Nancy. What is the legal package dose for edibles that have both THC and CBD? Maybe you'd like to address that before we move on.
Ooh, legal package dose for edibles that have both. Still, the THC is really what we see being limited the most. I haven't, again, because the CBD is generally what we see more in the medical products, I'd have to look into what is or whether there is a specific limit when it comes to CBD. But we do know that the THC in an edible cannot surpass 10 milligrams in the whole package. This is not per piece in the package. So if you get, say, 5 soft chews and the package says 10 milligrams, this doesn't mean that each chew has 10. It means each has approximately 2 milligrams in a legal market product. And now CBD, as not being known as sort of the psychoactive product, not being as the one that generally would cause impairment, I haven't seen what the guidelines are on CBD limitations. It's probably something I should look into a little bit more, especially if we do talk more about medicinal side of things. Did that make sense?
Yeah, very good question too. Thank you.
It was. Excellent question.
Yeah, so this brings us to our next topic of discussion, and this is looking at bioavailability. And again, kind of going back to that theme of why THC might even affect people differently. So this is just to get a general idea of where you are in your understanding, and then we'll discuss it further. So just launching this poll. What is bioavailability? Is it the percentage of product that is absorbed by the body when consumed, the difference between inhaled versus edible, different one from one person to the next, or all of the above? And again, just to see your understanding, there's definitely not judging on correctness here.
I often joke when we do these presentations that you come to see a presentation on substance use, and this is the part where it kind of turns into a science and a math class.
Exactly. And I'm going to give just a couple more seconds to get some answers in. We're very close to good participation. And yeah, closing the poll in 3, 2, and 1. And sharing results. Steve, would you like to reveal the correct answer, and then I'll discuss a little bit?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so in fact, bioavailability is all of those different criteria included in one. So with any substance that you take, whether it be a headache tablet, vitamins, any kind of product, and including cannabis, obviously, not all of that product is able to be broken down and used by your body. So only a certain percentage of it gets used by your body, the rest gets excreted. And this is the concept of bioavailability. What is that percentage that is actually absorbed when you consume something? And there's obviously differences between person to person in terms of your metabolism and in terms of your body composition, but also in terms of the different methods of consumption. So we're going to look at this in a bit more detail right away. If we look at bioavailability of THC in a smoked versus a vaporized cannabis, for example, if I look at a 1 gram joint of dried cannabis, and this would contain as much as 300 milligrams of THC, and we'll use that as our example. So this contains about 30% THC, and the bioavailability is 25 to 27% of that. So if you are to smoke that product, then you will be able to absorb up to 81 milligrams of THC. And again, this may vary from person to person and within those limits and those conditions. If we compare it to our vape on the other side here, 1 gram vape pen, and we know that THC is more concentrated in a vape pen. So in this case, 900 milligrams. Your THC concentration can be as much as 90% in vapes compared to the 30% in your dried cannabis. And again, the bioavailability is also higher. So we have that at 30 to 60% bioavailability. This is the amount that your body could potentially absorb. Then up to 540 milligrams of THC can be absorbed from that vape cartridge. Quite a big difference, as you can see, in terms of that potency and what you would be able to, the effects that might be felt from those two different products. Steve. Oh, sorry, I'm going to move on to edibles. Yeah, so in terms of edibles, this is slightly different. So when we see THC bioavailability, Here the range is between 4 to 12%. And your initial thought might be, oh, wow, that's not so much. But, and again, let's look at that brownie that we have there on the side. 30 milligrams of THC from this particular brownie, 4 to 12 servings, as Steve was discussing. And in products that are made on the illegal market, that bioavailability will obviously be a lot more if there's higher THC in that product. But there's one little extra thing to note with edibles. When one consumes edibles, the THC is actually converted into a completely different product, and it's known as 11-hydroxy-THC. Now, this compound or this product is in fact a lot smaller, and it's way easier to be absorbed by your body, and so that makes it more potent, up to 3 times more potent. So although initially one thinks, yes, edibles have got way less bioavailability, because of the conversion of the products as we digest and absorb it, in fact, the potency can be also fairly strong.
Absolutely. And that's why we put this one sort of separate from the other two, in case you're wondering why we didn't put them side by side, because those numbers can be a little misleading. All right. Now, if we were to look at risks of cannabis use, we're going to see them highlighted in sort of each method of consumption. But these next few slides, you're going to see sort of specific risks and harm reduction strategies for each method itself of those 4 that we've really looked at: vaping, dabbing, eating, and smoking. We look at dried leaf cannabis. We talked about how earlier the onset can be very quick, peaks after about 30 minutes, lasts up to 6 hours. And there are specific risks of smoking dried leaf cannabis. The first is that smoking dried leaf cannabis has a greater sort of capacity for damage to the lungs and lung tissue than any other method of consumption. Because as you burn the product, you are releasing a great deal of carcinogens similar to what you might find in tobacco smoke, including things like cyanide, tar, ammonia, formaldehyde, benzene, that you can find in smoke being sort of consumed into the lungs. There's an exposure to toxic fumes like from pipes and bongs, especially if these are made of plastic. There's also the risk of spreading bacteria and viruses. This often happens when people are sharing joints and bongs. Probably not the best idea to be doing during an ongoing pandemic, but that's here nor there. Now, bowls may also be laced with other substances, and this is something that we've heard from some of the other regulators that we've spoken to over the last few weeks. This is something really important to note. So when we talk about reducing those harms, we want to try to limit the use of inhaled products and take a little bit longer of breaks. And if you're using a bong, consider keeping it clean and maybe using glass or steel or brass products instead of plastic. Waiting, again, about 10 to 20 minutes between puffs, part of that start low, go slow. Avoiding sharing and seeking medical attention as needed. All right. Then we look at edibles. I mentioned this before. The onset of effects can be quite a bit longer, but even the effects themselves can last for up to a full 24-hour period. So this impairment can be slower, but really you're seeing a slower peak and a slower decline versus those inhaleds that'll happen over a more compressed period of time. A couple of risks that come to mind here: the idea of cannabis poisoning and hospitalization. Now, cannabis poisoning can happen through any method of consumption, the idea of taking on more than the body can really handle. But this is particularly an issue with edibles, especially with youth and new users, because if they've smoked cannabis in the past, they feel effects quickly. If they have an edible for the first or second time and it doesn't affect them as quickly, they might think it's not working. So they feel like they have to take more, and they may consume far more than the body can handle. And when that first edible hits them, they're still going to be getting affected by the other servings that they've had. There can be unpredictable results if making edibles at home or purchasing from the illegal market due to those higher quantities of THC. There is some research that suggests that consuming on an empty stomach may increase sort of the sharpness or the speed of the effects themselves, as well as the potential risk of accidental ingestion by young children or pets. Because, I mean, a lot of edibles tend to be sweet candy, things that kids would like. I have a dog that counter surfs all the time. He would probably love them. So again, you want to really consider any food allergies when you're looking at products that you're eating, setting limits, slightly longer limits, like I said, 30 minutes to 4 hours between, eating a meal before having an edible, particularly something a bit more high in sort of calories or fats, seeking medical attention if you feel unwell, and ensuring that your edibles, if you have them and purchase them, are stored safely and out of the reach of children and pets. Yvette?
Yeah, and before we move on, another question there, really good question. How do fast-acting edibles sold at legal dispensaries work? How does the edible hit much faster? Steve?
The theory behind that would likely be due to the fact that the product is probably smaller. I'd have to look into, again, whether or not these are actually marketed a certain way. It's sort of like the idea of marketing sativa versus indica products. They don't really have as much of a marketable difference as they used to because the products are changing over time. Again, it would be sort of how they're promoted, what else might possibly be in the product itself. Is it being mixed? What sort of ingredients are being used in there that may sort of mirror or mimic certain effects? It'd be something I'd be curious to see what else is going on in that product that would change the speed at which it's affecting you.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so moving on to our next question. In 2018, cannabis use was documented in what percentage of hospitalizations of youth aged 10 to 24? And this is substance-related hospitalizations, just to clarify. So 14, 26, 40, or 63%. What's your guess on this one?
Mm-hmm. Good divide here. A lot of uncertainty.
Mm-hmm. Yes, this is a tricky one.
It's a good question, though.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and I think we have almost, yeah, we're getting to about 80% of our participants who are voting. Going to close this vote in 3, 2, 1, and sharing the results. So the majority, only by a little bit here, are saying 40%. What is the correct answer, Steve?
Our slight majority would indeed be correct. We know it is around 2 and 5. Now, do you want to elaborate on this a little further, Yvette, or do you want me to take this one?
No, sure. So yes, we're seeing that in terms of substance-related hospitalizations of youth, 10 to 24, about 40% is the actual number there. Now, bearing in mind that this can also be youth that are taking it accidentally, like Steve said, in terms of candy that looks very similar to normal candy, things like that. And a lot of the hospitalizations are also centered around mental disturbances, sort of mental issues that people are experiencing related to taking cannabis. And the second most common substance that is resultant in hospitalization for this age is in fact alcohol. But cannabis is definitely fairly high in terms of hospitalizations when looking at substance-related issues. So moving on from there, now we're looking at these sort of more high potency products. Let's have a look at those. So in terms of dabbing, the onset of effects again is very quick, and there's that peak between 10 to 30 minutes, and lasting up to 6 hours. Very similar to the inhaled products that we were talking about previously. Now with products like dabbing, over intoxication is a very, very big risk because of the potency of the product, obviously. And then obviously cannabis use disorder. This is where you're getting that tolerance, that dependency starting to creep in, and we're going to look at that in a bit more detail later. But the impacts on mental health, again, very high because of the potency of these products, and especially when we're looking at youth, where they have the brain still very much under development. And then burns caused by improper preparation or use. There's extremely high temperatures used with dabbing, so very high risk of burns. So what are some of the ways to reduce those harms then? So obviously we do not recommend that new users or youth under 25 are using these kind of products because, and especially if they're coming from the illegal market where there can be other substances being introduced into these products which may be carcinogenic or toxic. However, if people are starting to use products like this, we recommend starting with products the size of a grain of rice, so really, really small, and waiting at least 10 minutes before deciding whether to use more. And if any negative side effects are being noticed by yourself or people around you, definitely to seek medical attention, not to sort of play around and wait on this one. Moving on to vaped products, very similar in terms of their onset, in terms of their duration, and again, that risk of high potency. But associated further with risk with vaping is obviously the illnesses that may occur in your lungs and your damage to the respiratory system from heating and inhaling. Also, especially in illegal products, we have sometimes the addition of vitamin E, which is a thickening agent, and this can actually clog and congest the lungs quite a bit. So that additional risk associated with that, plus the use of other substances like the chemicals and the flavorants, which again may not be of good quality, may be toxic, may be carcinogenic. And then the actual toxins from the materials used to vape with, especially when you're buying a cheaper product or a product that's not been bought through the correct marketing again. Also burning could be a result, not quite as high as with dabbing, but definitely, especially again in those products where batteries, for example, may explode, that kind of thing, especially if they're not good quality products. So in terms of reducing harms, again, not recommended for users under the age of 25, especially from that illegal market. Looking for vapes that have lower concentrations of THC, starting with one puff, waiting for 20 minutes to see how you feel, and again, seeking help if needed and as needed. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you. That was excellent. Now we look at the risks of cannabis and alcohol. We know that about 1 in 8 youth report using alcohol together with cannabis in grades 7 to 12, and there are specific risks that we have to consider here. First is the notion of overintoxication. We know that cannabis and alcohol can mutually sort of amplify each other's effects, and the use of cannabis prior to using alcohol can sometimes delay the feeling of drunkenness, which may make someone who would normally consume, say, X amount of drinks, they don't feel as impaired as maybe they normally would. So they'll drink more thinking that they're not quite impaired yet, which could lead to the potential risk of overintoxication from one or both products, which could be seen through things like dizziness, nausea, vomiting, blacking out, paranoia, anxiety, confusion. We also see the risks of dehydration. Alcohol is a known diuretic, meaning it pushes a lot of the fluid out of the body, which can cause that sort of increased risk of dehydration. In many situations where individuals find themselves hungover after a night of drinking, this can be caused by the fact they don't have a lot of fluid in the body. So part of that hangover is leading to things like stiffness, headache, fatigue caused by dehydration. We also see the increased risks of impaired driving. We know that individuals that consume cannabis prior to driving, according to a CCSA report from 2013, estimates that the risks of being involved in a fatal collision increase by about 5 times if an individual uses cannabis prior to driving. And those risks actually increase by about 40 times if an individual uses cannabis and alcohol prior to driving. So if we're looking at how to reduce these harms, consider using one substance or the other. We're not saying you have to not use either. You could choose not to use either, that's great. But if you do enjoy using both, it might be a good idea to look at using one or the other. And if you do use both, consider drinking less alcohol than you normally would, or look for lower THC potency cannabis products than you might normally do. And finally, plan a safe ride home. As opposed to simply saying don't drink and drive, we look for that sort of more positive messaging. Instead of saying what not to do, we want you to look at what you should do. Plan a safe ride, call ahead, plan with a friend, plan with family, get a backup plan as well in case that first plan falls through. Now, if we're looking at cannabis impairment, we talked about the idea there's that risk of impaired driving. We want to know what impairment actually might look like, what might be the sort of things individuals might look for on the road, or what might be a way to tell someone is becoming impaired by cannabis. You may see things like red or bloodshot eyes. You may see them experiencing like clearing their throat due to like dry mouth. Their breathing might become more shallow, perhaps a rapid heart rate. We've also seen reports of dizziness, poor coordination, and finally fatigue. Someone might just get overtired after they've been using or after they're coming down off that impairment as well. When we look at the behavioral signs, these may be things like delayed reactions. And this is really important when it comes to driving, not being able to react quickly to, say, a pedestrian moving out in front of you or a car stopping in front of you or a light changing colors. There could be a paranoia or anxiety that may affect an individual's ability to focus on the road. When stopped by law enforcement, they may find out that you have an unfocused gaze. So if they're testing vision, they might find you're unable to really focus on what they're doing. Could be a distorted sense of reality. Maybe you're with someone, and this again doesn't have to just be driving. Perhaps they're starting to have ideas that don't really make the same amount of sense they normally would. Or again, they could find themselves struggling to focus. And a lot of these signs of impairment make it very difficult to do high-skilled things, such as, say, operate a vehicle, cut the grass, work on major projects. So this is why we look for impairment as a potential risk of sort of completing these higher skilled activities, shall we say.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the other most common products that are combined with cannabis is obviously tobacco. And we see that a third of Canadians report using tobacco and cannabis together, either rarely, sometimes, or often. So how are the risks made worse when we use these two products together? So first of all, tobacco contains nicotine, highly addictive substance. So when you combine these two products together, that risk of getting that cannabis dependence or addiction to that product obviously increases. And then also increased risk to the lungs and the respiratory system because of inhalation of hot smoke and products and health products and anything that may be added into those, especially with nicotine and tobacco products. We know that lots of other chemicals are added into those products too. And then obviously poorer mental health and greater problematic behaviors, things like skipping school, not completing work on time. These are all things that we've noticed when these two products are combined together. Moving on to some additional risks of youth using cannabis. And the first one Steve has mentioned, but just to go over it in a bit more detail again, impaired driving. So we see there that the risk of a fatal collision increases by 5 times when one has taken cannabis and then drives afterwards. And the other component here is that youth are 4 times more likely to adults to get into the vehicle of a driver that has consumed cannabis, especially if they've consumed cannabis as well. So this is really important messaging that we need to convey to our youth, is that message of planning a safe ride, whether that be getting an app on your phone like Uber, calling for a parent to help, calling for another person that they trust to help and to provide that ride option. And in terms of that Uber conversation, getting apps on your phone, these need to be prepared and done ahead of time before one is going to go out and use products, because once one is impaired, it's harder to coordinate that actual act of downloading an app, making sure that there's a credit card associated with that account, all of those sides of impairment and seeking alternative rides home. Then the other important risk to consider is the impact to academic performance. We see that once youth start using cannabis once a month or more than that, they are more likely to get into academic issues like not completing their homework, not achieving high grades, maybe not even finishing high school. Cannabis does affect concentration. It does affect the ability to judge, like we've said before, judgment. And so therefore we do promote not using cannabis at times that require focus and attention, like before a big exam, for example. Then the last one that we're going to touch on right now is the mental health risks. Adolescents who use cannabis regularly during their teen years are more likely to have mental health issues and social health issues, and especially if there is that family history of those kind of issues involved. So again, trying to promote that avoidance of using cannabis, especially at high concentrations of THC and especially at a younger age, and if there's a family history of mental health disorders.
Mm-hmm. Now, you may see here in the notes that it says if under the age of 16, research has shown that's where there's a greater capacity for risks to mental health. So again, we would still encourage youth to not use before hitting a legal age period, but that's why you see the number specifically there. Now, when does cannabis use itself become a problem, or when can it become a problem? At the beginning of the presentation, we talked about the importance of neutrality. We're not saying cannabis is a problem. That's not what we're saying at all, but we're saying it can become one. And when that threshold is really crossed is when we start to see cannabis use affecting a person's life in a negative way, especially if they continue to use, cognizant and aware of the fact, or even unaware of the fact, that they may be experiencing problems going on in their life surrounded by or connected to their cannabis use.
So this brings us to our final poll question for today. And we would like to know what you think. How many teens using cannabis in Canada will experience signs of dependency in their lifetime? Is it 1 in 4, 1 in 6, 1 in 11, or 1 in 20? And again, specifically looking at teens who are starting to use cannabis.
Mm-hmm. Loving the poll responses today, by the way.
Yeah, very interactive. Thank you all for your participation. We have a couple more seconds there. Just waiting for those last few responses. And closing the poll in 3, 2, 1. So we see that our audience is saying 1 in 6. Let's reveal the correct answer, Steve.
You got it.
Okay, so yes, our audience is right on the mark. In terms of teens starting to use cannabis at an early age, there is a 1 in 6 chance that they will develop cannabis dependency in their lifetime. And again, we're not saying that they will, we're saying there's that risk and that chance. For adults, if you're starting at a later age, that changes to 1 in 11. So quite a big difference there in terms of risk. And also we find that daily users, people who are using cannabis on a daily basis, their risk increases to 1 in 4 and even as much as 1 in 2. So from 25 to 50% chance of developing cannabis use disorder. So let's look at some of those signs of problem cannabis use. What do we mean by problem cannabis use? So some of these include when conflict starts coming in with your family or your friends about your use. They may not agree with it. They may be asking a lot of questions. If you are resorting to stealing to pay for your cannabis or other behavioral issues, unable to focus on your normal responsibilities, your day-to-day tasks, looking at using cannabis more to get the same effects over time, so that dependency coming in, Regular use at an early age, as you know, that risk is going to increase to 1 in 6, sorry. Unable to stop, reduce use, so it's becoming a habit that you can't control. Habitual daily use, and using it as a major form of recreation. So in the past, perhaps you were doing other things like sports and hobbies, but now you're mainly resorting to cannabis to get that same sense of enjoyment out of life. Spending less time with your friends and loved ones, losing interest in other activities. And then obviously if you're using cannabis and doing activities like driving or using equipment, things like that. And using cannabis to cope with depression, anxiety, stress, and other issues.
Absolutely. Now, we're not saying that individuals that show 1 or 2 of these symptoms once in a while have a problem. That's not what we're saying at all. And even if they exhibit a few of these over an extended period of time, this doesn't automatically say they do have a problem. But we do understand that substance use, cannabis use being no different, we can see existing on a bit of a spectrum. Some people choose not to use cannabis. They're not going to experience negative effects. It's kind of like saying if you never drink alcohol, you'll never have a hangover. Statistically, that's correct. It's the same thing with cannabis. We look at low risk use. Many individuals find themselves here. You know, there are potentials for some risks. Maybe the odd time they'll oversleep, maybe the odd time they'll forget something they were talking about, but these aren't serious risks. But these are the individuals that have set limits on how much they're using. They're designating drivers beforehand. They may use different substances, but they're not using them at the same time. They're avoiding mixing. Again, they may run into the odd negative effect, but this isn't really where you're seeing problems happening, so the risk is quite low. Where we see risky or problematic use is when an individual begins to use more regularly, it's beginning to affect relationships, school, and work, and we're seeing a loss of interest in other activities, and more of those markers that Yvette alluded to begin to arise. And by that point of disordered or dependent use, this is where cannabis use begins to feel less like a choice. It almost feels natural, that this is just something that you just do. It becomes a main coping strategy, and those other sorts of methods that an individual may use to promote wellness, such as exercise, going for walks, spending time with people they care about, those other sorts of supports begin to fall away, and this becomes that main coping strategy. Individuals may find themselves at this point breaking laws or getting into trouble related to or as a result of their cannabis use, and there's an increased risk of both physical and long-term psychological effects. Now, the reason we call this a spectrum is people can move either way. That's why we kind of put in these roundabouts. An individual may experience low-risk use and never move beyond that, or they may stop using. An individual may stay at low risk and, continue to use, but not run into problems. Someone else may progress to problematic use and then find themselves moving back towards low risk. They experience a couple problems, so they begin to set their own limits and their own strategies. And even when individuals hit that point of dependency, whereby they may feel or become worried or even become diagnosed with a cannabis use disorder, just like the idea of no use, it's never too early and it's never too late to both seek support and learn more about cannabis, as well as its risks and healthy lifestyle choices. And that's why we have these discussions, whether it's someone that's never used before or it's someone that's used for 5 or 10 years. So finally, as we're getting wrapped up, I see we've got about 3 minutes left. We are right on time today. We know there are free and confidential services available all across Canada. We see some of the provincial providers here, such as Connex Ontario here in Ontario. In Saskatchewan, we know we've got the Healthline available through the Ministry of Health. Northwest Territories, we see the NWT Helpline, Nova Scotia Health Authority. Each province does have their own provincial providers when it comes to looking for supports. And even at a regional level, you can always seek out supports, whether that is through substance use counseling, whether that's through addiction centers, whether that's even just through learning and doing research online into various credited educational resources. The Center of Addiction and Mental Health offers the Cannabis Knowledge Exchange Hub, or the Cannabis K e-Hub, which is an excellent resource for individuals looking to learn more about cannabis use. And when we look at youth, the individuals or the services we like to refer them to tend to be things like Kids Help Phone, which is that free national charity operating 3 different counseling centers and offering community engagement initiatives for staff and volunteers across Canada. Kids Help Phone is always available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We do not get paid by them to say this. We just bring this up because it is a large-scale national program. We also know that they do have a search engine that will connect youth with various supports local to them in their own communities. And if someone needs to access crisis service, they can text CONNECT to 686868. For post-secondary students in Ontario and Nova Scotia, we have the Good to Talk helpline. I believe it has a slightly different name in some of the other provinces. I think one I saw was Good to Chat out in BC. I have to think about it a little more. But we know that these are supporting the individuals that are slightly older, dealing with a range of issues that could be related to mental health and well-being. Doesn't necessarily just have to be substance use. Could be dealing with academic stress, personal family relationships, financial concerns. But the point is, these resources are always available and they can be accessed at any time. And in many situations, they're free. And in almost all situations, they are completely anonymous. Again, I want to thank all of you for joining us today. I do see we are at 59 minutes past the hour. We were able to wrap this all up in 60 minutes. I'm very proud of that. Thank you very much, Yvette. It was great presenting with you.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone who participated today for your involvement. And yeah, any questions, feel free to ask us. Thanks, Steve.
Absolutely. We'll be willing to stay on the line here for the next little while if anyone has any questions. Otherwise, you can feel free to log off, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of your day.